Thank you particularly to Natalie, to Your Excellency, and Lady Lucy, and copyright holders and friends. It is wonderful to see you here today, and it is really an honour to be here in this magnificent setting at a time when Europe is in some ways, I think, in turmoil about what has happened, and it's a great opportunity to show that what joins us together is greater than what divides us, and that I think is important, that we do share a very, very important common heritage between us and the friendship that perhaps the British showed to the Belgians 100 years ago, and the friendship that the citizens of Ypres show and of Belgium show to British pilgrims and tourists to this day. And I think I would like to stress my feeling of great solidarity and great affection for Belgium. So, I've got a number of friends here this evening who have actually accompanied me on the journey that this book has gone through to its publication. You have offered incisive wisdom, belief, encouragement, a listening ear, and unstinting support, as well as initially doubts that poetry is a genre that both was and still is accessible. And I was lucky enough to find in Pen and Sword a publisher, and in Jen Newby, who sadly isn't with us this evening, an editor who believed that the story of the Great War could and should be told through the eyes and lives of its women poets. So you all know who you are, so thank you for the support that you have shown me. And I would also like to mention Warrant Officer Earl, who has left public order duties in Cyprus to parachute in to be with us this evening. It's a great surprise and a great, great treat to see you here. So thank you, Chris. Thank you very much for coming. And also thanks to the copyright holders whom I have been able to trace, some of whom are also here this evening, and in the case of a New Zealand family, will, in very good iPlayer style, they're going to listen again to the talk. And to the copyright holders, your kindness in allowing me to publish your ancestors' work has certainly enriched the text, and on your behalf I have made a donation to Combat Stress and also to Never Such Innocence. So let me just tell you very briefly about Combat Stress, which was initially founded by women in 1919 because women realised that there were men coming back from the Great War suffering terrible mental trauma. Physical trauma, physical wounds are easy to see, mental trauma much less so. And so these amazing women founded the charity Combat Stress, and they still work with some of our bravest veterans who, just like men and women a century ago, have returned from operations in many theatres in which British troops have been and continue to be deployed, and they are still suffering from mental trauma, which most of us cannot even begin to understand. Combat Stress, since its foundation, has helped over 100,000 ex-servicemen and women, and they have 6,000 current users. The therapies and support they provide enable them and their families who suffer alongside their loved one often to help them start a journey towards recovery. And very briefly, an anecdote that I heard at a very recent Combat Stress event was when they had a lady speaker, and she and her fellow Combat Stress users' military experience covered multiple theatres, many forms of combat, and all arms of the military. One thing defined all of these veterans, irrespective of their rank, their age, their gender, their PTSD or combat stress was such that they were simply unable to go to Tesco's. And Laura, Kirsty, Julie, if you could make yourselves known, if anybody would like to find out a little bit more about combat stress, if you could just give us a quick wave, we know who you are. The other charity is Never Such Innocence, and its mission is to reach out to children in schools across the English-speaking world. We're going global this year, aren't we, Lucy?
We are.
And through beautifully presented resources, which are updated in each of the 4 centenary years by relevant experts in their field, NSI encourages pupils to use art, theatre and poetry to reflect upon and understand events that might otherwise be ancient history. Their success in achieving its aims, I think, is summed up by a 10-year-old little girl, the winner of their 2016 age 9 to 11 poetry competition. She wrote, thinking about the millions affected by war today, she thought back to those dead heroes and heroines of that war that to her seemed ancient history, and she asked, what would they think of our world today? I think the question is unanswerable, but maybe my good friends from Never Such Innocence, if you could just make yourselves known, if anybody's interested in the project, please do speak to them about it. I would like now to begin with two anecdotes. The first relates to my family connection with the Great War and, very importantly, with Belgium. My grandfather served throughout the war as an army surgeon near Saint-Omer. He had a long-standing close friend in the Belgian army, and when my mother was born during the war, grandfather asked him to be her godfather. Both men survived the war, and my mother and her elder sister spent many holidays in Belgium. If we could fast forward to the unveiling of the Menin Gate in Ypres in 1927, one very privileged 10-year-old was taken by her godfather to attend this ceremony. Latterly, whenever I told her I was visiting Wipers, on cue she would say, "You do know that I went to the unveiling, don't you, darling?" Which I replied, also on cue, "Yes, and you were car sick along the way." Family history so often combines the sublime and the ridiculous. The second anecdote relates to my teaching English Literature A-level and adult education in Chelmsford. There were a few years in the 1990s when we actually had the opportunity as tutors to choose a coursework text, and I decided that an appropriate text to use would be a women's anthology of poetry of the First World War. When I presented this idea to my class, they were absolutely horrified. They looked at me. They thought I'd gone mad. They said, "Women's war poetry?" The question mark was definitely audible. They decided they would put me right. They told me the war poets, audible capital letters, were Rupert Brooke, Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon. They were there. We would like to study them. Well, I don't usually bow under pressure, and I certainly wasn't going to bow under this type of pressure. I had chosen to study women's war poetry, and study it we would. And I decided that the first thing I would do would be to show them a video called The Roses of No Man's Land, which is about nurses who served in France and Belgium during the First World War. And as the students watched this video, it became very obvious to them that the nurses had indeed been in the midst of the blood, the suffering, and the horrors of what was previously accepted as the masculine preserve of war. So the students then became very interested. Perhaps the women poets might have something to say about war. They began to ask me questions. Who were these women? What had they done? Were there more women than the 79 in the anthology we were studying? The more questions they asked, the more I realised I didn't actually have the answers. So I decided that it was time I found the answers, hung up my chalk, and took myself back to university to study for a PhD in women's war poetry. I phoned the University of Essex. They said, "Women's war poetry? What a wonderful idea!" It was a very pleasant surprise. They actually did more than say what a wonderful idea. They found me an amazing supervisor, and they also gave me a bursary. I was on my way. I was having a midlife crisis, my family decided. I actually thought mine was relatively harmless. If you were to ask my daughters, who are here tonight, and who frequently announced that it was like living in a trench, and my husband, who shared and still shares his home with approximately 500 dead women, they might actually announce that it was quite a serious midlife crisis. Feel free to ask them. So, an early discovery was that of the over 2,000 British poets whose work was published during the Great War, more than a quarter were women. Don't worry, I'm not going to tell you about all of them, although, given a couple of days, I would be very happy to do so, but maybe that would be overstaying our welcome. So, if initially this figure seemed amazing, actually if you think about it, it's not, because this was a total war. And so consequently, in a total war, it's not just 50, or in those days 48 or something % of the population, i.e. the male side of the population that's involved. It affects everyone. And poetry was a very, very widespread genre. I actually say it was a little bit like the tweet or the Facebook of today. People would write a quick poem and share it with friends and family. So that women responded in this way to the Great War and events is hardly surprising. And so the male literary critics, who still have a tendency to dismiss women poets as at worst irrelevant and at best peripheral, are actually denying us a huge swathe of reactions to the war. And war is far more than the killing of males by males. Yet women's poetry is often broader than men's, reflecting how warfare involves far more than writing about the camaraderie of those who live and die in battle. And unusually for the time, as far as war poetry was concerned, newspapers, publishers, and editors were totally gender blind. The first woman's poem appeared in the Times Literary Supplement of the 14th of August 1914. It was entitled Belgia Barlas, and it shows Belgium grimly hanging on, knowing that while she cannot defeat the enemy, she can at least delay his advance, whilst the numerically superior British expeditionary and French forces muster. By September 1914, British women were flocking to Belgium, and in unofficial volunteer medical capacities. Many witnessed the plight of Belgian refugees fleeing the German onslaught. Caught up in the retreat from Antwerp, May Sinclair was haunted by the human tragedy which was unfolding before her eyes. So haunted that at night, I cannot sleep here in England, but I get up and I go, not to the cities of Flanders, not to the city of Bruges or the city of Antwerp or the city of Ghent, but somewhere in the fields, to the house with the slender door, standing low and alone in the flat Flemish land. Of course, for the majority of women's first contact with the war was that agonising moment of saying farewell to a beloved husband, son, fiancé, father or brother. Multiple poems on this very feminine theme take us to the heart of the women's war. Winifred Letts saw troops leave Dublin for France in August 1914. Against the beating of the martial drum, she noticed a woman sobs her heart out with her head against the door. For the man that's called to leave her, God, have pity on the poor. For many women, the last, all too often final goodbye was at a train station. Alexandra Grantham, in late February 1915, advises women and mothers, when their sons towards far fights are starting, by the loud train be mirth, not moan of fears, good wishes, agony of farewell kisses, as they together for the last time stand. The green flag waves, the white steam hisses, love's last fond greeting waved with trembling hands. Only when the train has steamed away can the woman allow herself the release of tears. Some women knew that they had insufficient self-control. Their farewell would take place in the privacy of the home, for not all can be the heroine that others are. Women in the Great War are invariably associated with knitting. Lord Kitchener was only too aware, with hundreds of thousands of men having agreed that your country needs you, they also needed socks. Lots of them. 300,000 pairs to be precise, by Christmas. He at least realised that the war wouldn't be over by then. Joining forces with Queen Mary, an appeal was put out to the women of the Empire. Idle moments would no longer be tolerated. Instead, do your bit, knit a stitch. By November 1914, English women and children, supported by those in the Dominions, had produced over 700,000 pairs of socks and thousands of other knitted goods. Australian sheep became a little concerned, according to this young poet. Mary had a little lamb. Its fleece was quite expensive. It followed her to school one day and came home feeling pensive. The little maids at school that day forgot their sons and letters. They pulled the wool all off its back and knit it into sweaters. Knitting could be therapeutic, as one poet observing her mother poignantly noticed. It's not a sock she's knitting, it's a web of love for him. By 1915, England was facing a munitions crisis. Now the women of England had to become the girl behind the man behind the gun. Munitions work making was actually the most controversial area of women's wartime activities. For some, factory work offered real opportunities of self-improvement. After years of skivvying as very, very low-paid servants, and the majority did not live in the cosy downstairs atmosphere of Downton Abbey, a job in munitions factories held out the possibility of better wages and the acquisition of skills. Although some middle-class women who lost their servants to the factories were quick to pour scorn on the aspirations of those who joined what became known as Lloyd George's Munitions Army. Several poems spitefully reflect this attitude, thereby maligning many munitions workers whose wages were very far from the riches reported by, inter alia, the Daily Mail. Nevertheless, many workers subscribed to the various government-devised schemes which encouraged the population to subsidise the war. One munition worker explains, "We're working on munitions to help to win the war. Now England needs more money, so has called on us once more. Right gladly would we aid her by giving of our own. That's why we are so busy putting money in war loan." Black humour, so much a part of trench life, also occurred in the factories, where explosions and fatalities became all too familiar. Perhaps to hide their own grief for comrades at a factory in Scotland, some little door-knock girls explain how. 7 little door-knock girls did some NG mix. One was overcome with fumes, and then there were 6. 3 little door-knock girls went to work quite new. The acid fumes did smother one, and then there were 2. Some poets were affronted by women's involvement in manufacturing the weapons of death. They believed that women's hands should minister unto the flame of life, and munitions work taints all that womanhood should stand for. Irrespective of a poetical theme, there is never one universal response. Just as there were over 500 female poets, there were 500 different interpretations of the war and women's involvement. Even nursing, a sublimely feminine activity, tensions are also apparent. Some poet nurses dare to express doubts about their role. For if a nurse is faithful to her trust, she will simply send back a man to satisfy the lust of the war machine. This dichotomy exercised both professionals and volunteers, such as Eva Dobell, who thinks it might have been better in that grim trench to die than drag maimed years out endlessly. Those of us familiar with the images of the wounded, the maimed, and the shell-shocked may well agree. A few nurses' poems highlight the occasional tensions between the professional nurses and the volunteers, or VADs, as many of them were. Whilst not in polite society, pausing over the soldiers' many alternatives to the acronym VAD, the mother of one member of the Voluntary Aid Detachment sympathised with her daughter Grace, who was periodically referred to as valueless a duffer, or very active danger. She understood why in her unflattering uniform, Grace might have felt virtuous and dumpy, but she reminded her that at least in the eyes of her very own warrant officer, she was verily a darling. Her attempts to be valiant and determined were so impressive that they married after the war. Let us now turn our thoughts to one of the thousands of Belgians who had fled the onslaught of what a Belgian nurse described as the grey wave of German soldiery. Many, including former policeman Jacques Ornay, came to English seaside towns such as Torquay. Here, Jacques met and became friends with a young VAD named Agatha Christie. She would immortalise her new acquaintance as the great Belgian detective Hercule Poirot, and if you have ever wondered how Christie acquired her pharmaceutical knowledge and her knowledge about poisons, she was trained in pharmacy while serving with the VAD. As well as observing Ornay and listening to his stories, Christie was editing her hospital's magazine. Many hospitals found producing magazines was therapeutic for both staff and patients. Her colleague and friend, Alberta Vicarage, contributed some poems. Alberta has her own claim to fame, although, sadly, one that is now written totally out of the male war poetry history books. The very widely read Saturday Westminster Gazette frequently set poetry competitions. They offered a 1 guinea prize, which was over £100 in today's money. In January 1918, the competition was restricted to those on active service, which naturally included nurses. Second prize went to a budding poet of the Manchester Regiment, one Wilfred Owen. The winner's laurels went to Alberta Vicarage. Not all VADs were nurses. Some, ironically, as many would have been waited on at home by armies of servants, filled lowly domestic roles. At least one General Service VAD immortalised her most hated task, which occurred at a time of day which in her pre-war existence she barely knew existed. Her ode is addressed to a recalcitrant gas oven. Goodbye at 5 to sleep so sweet. At earliest dawn we used to meet. For you, my friend, I had to greet. About 5:30. And on flu days, twice weekly treat. You were so dirty. General Service VAD Winifred Wedgwood pleads for her colleagues, the Scullions, not to be forgotten in all the hyperbole about VAD nurses. Our nurses are always apparent. We give them their halos all right. But how many think of our Scullions? Because they work buried from sight. Over in France and unoccupied Belgium, other British women were doing their bit, including the members of the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry. This unit had been formed pre-war with the rather optimistic idea that the Fannies, as they were affectionately dubbed, would gallop onto the battlefield to rescue casualties, and they would gallop back, dragging a stretcher behind them. Well, the realities of the Western Front were such that galloping on horseback proved a bit of a non-starter. And so, ever adaptable, the Fannies, who were predominantly very upper-class women, transformed themselves into ambulance drivers. Initially, working with the Belgian, because the Belgians had the good sense to accept the services of the Fannies, while the British and the French were rather reluctant to do so to begin with. And eventually they decided, yes, they would like some help, please. And so the Fannies became ambulance drivers, dedicated, determined and dauntless, showing superb driving skills and utter disregard for their own safety. They tell harrowing stories about driving cargoes of wounded in all weathers and across all terrains. Fannies saw action in both the First and the Second War, and they remain in existence today. I don't know if today's Fannies are budding poets, but their foremothers were, often giving humorous accounts of life then and now. One wished my mother could see me now, with my grease gun under my car, filling my differential ere I head for the sea afar. The conditions that the women worked in were often overwhelming, both mentally and physically. Leave, when it came, was very badly needed, although one little Fanny, going back to Blighty, stopped in Paris on the way, to buy a naughty nightie. Whilst most British women served in France or Flanders, some voluntary units headed to the war's now more forgotten theatres, Serbia, Salonika, and the Russian front. Amongst the best known were the Scottish Women's Hospital Units for Foreign Service. By 1918, the 14 SWH units and their hundreds of female volunteers had served in all theatres. The unit's administrator, suffragist, Mary Henderson's poetry, shows her boundless admiration for her friend, the unit's founder, Dr. Elsa Ingalls, and her many colleagues. At one point she wrote, "I've seen you kneeling on the wooden floor, tending your wounded on their straw-strewn beds." Heedless of how, on the Eastern Front, women were so close to the action, to aeroplane duels, which Henderson poetically refers to as birds of menace, were fought quite literally over their heads. Throughout the war, serving women forged close bonds with their colleagues. Post-war, contrary to what some ill-informed male critics claim, they maintained these bonds through associations, reunions, and newsletters. Some even had their own song, which they had initially belted out through young lungs. As they aged, they held association meetings, still singing in frailer voices the lines that reminded them of the days when women too had done their little bit to win the war. Words that also linked them with their Scottish heritage, because they had a parody to the tune of "Do You Ken John Peel?" And the words that they sung were "Do You Ken Royaumont?", which was their main base in France. It was a huge abbey that they had turned into a hospital, and being Scottish and being great believers in fresh air, they used to nurse their casualties and make sure that they stayed out about 18 hours a day. And so you have all these poor patients being laid outside for the benefits of fresh air. By 1917, if Britain were not to be starved into surrender, a women's land army had to be created. Once again, women from across the British Isles responded to this latest call to service. One member of the Women's Land Army recalled, "We were summoned from the city, from the cottage and the hall, from the hillside and the valley, where we answered to the call, for we're fighting for our country as we till the fertile soil." The pay was poor, the hours were long, and the work was arduous and lonely. One member of this newly formed land army wondered in her heart of hearts if she would actually be up to the job. "I'm a-thinking and a-thinking of the farm where I'll be sent, of the lonely little furrow where my days will oft be spent, of the harmless cows that poets say do naught but chew the cud, though I know when I go milking they'll be sure to have my blood." Despite their misgivings, using what the Ministry for Food referred to as the food bullet, the WLA successfully won the war against starvation. If we think of globalisation, it actually was not quite such a new idea, because in 1913, Britain had only produced 135 days of food for herself. The rest was imported, including thousands and thousands of hundredweights of potatoes from Germany. So the food war was one that really needed to be fought. Whilst the members of the land army poetically ploughed their lonely furrows, other poets turned for inspiration to the land of their birth and hoped that the Arcadian images of their homeland those who were fighting. Perhaps visions of their misty, sea-girt island in the sunset-haunted west would comfort the wounded and dying. Others recognised that although the land war was being fought across the Channel, those living in England's green and pleasant land were themselves in a new firing line. The skies, hitherto God's last area free from vice, initiate the aerial mine, with civilians and babes below as sacrifice. Death would henceforth rain down from the skies in what has been referred to as the First Battle of Britain. Now the guns of northern France and Flanders were also audible for the first time in south-east England. Clearly so in Kent, where Enid Bagnold wrote how, when lying in bed at night, there thumps at the heart of the hill, on the house wall, and runs in the grass at the foot of the trees, the reminder, the guns. Following the traditions of English pastoral poetry, some poets contrasted the seasons in England with the savagery of what was happening over there. Writing in spring 1917, Beatrice Mayer feels that, as for many at home, it is actually impossible to fully imagine the contrast between breaking buds and singing birds and the guns of France and Flanders. So they go on killing, dying, this evening, and through summer, autumn, winter, and through spring. While civilians at home struggled to fully comprehend the horrors of this first technological war, one who experienced it at first hand was a woman who, in my, of course, unbiased opinion, was the finest war poet of either gender. Let me briefly tell you her story. In 1913, Vassar educated Mary Borden, daughter of a Chicago millionaire father and a Christian fundamentalist mother, was living in London, unhappily married to a Scottish missionary with whom she had spent several years in India. An ardent believer in women's suffrage, in the autumn of 1913, she, with hundreds of suffragettes, gathered outside the Houses of Parliament. May, as she was known, had the honour of being selected to fling a stone through the windows of the Treasury building. Although to her dismay 2 stones fell wide of the mark, the third crashed spectacularly and so satisfyingly through the glass. Unsurprisingly, she was arrested. She spent 5 nights in a prison cell before, to her fury, her husband paid her 25-shilling fine and she was released. When war was declared, she was heavily pregnant. She nevertheless gave her name to the London Committee of the French Red Cross, declaring her willingness to become a volunteer nurse, despite having no nursing skills and only a very basic knowledge of French. Her can-do attitude was such that she felt that neither of these small gaps in her CAV created insurmountable barriers. Babies are born, nursing skills can be acquired, and as a Vassar graduate she had enough grey matter to master the rudiments of French while sitting out the pregnancy. In January 1915, very recently delivered of her 3rd daughter, she went to Dunkirk to train in a grim French hospital in a former casino where hideously wounded and mortally sick French poilus were being, and I actually hate to use the word nursed, in conditions that resembled those of the Crimea War. May was horrified, particularly at the lack of night staff, and when a drunken male orderly was placed in charge of 2 wards, her patients ran out. Breaking all French nursing rules about women and night nursing, she organised a rota of night staff amongst the English volunteers. Having fallen foul of the French nursing authorities, she hatched a plan. She would develop her own unit, which would be embedded with the French army, and she would be the directrice. She estimated that the initial cost would be around £4,000, with running costs of about £200 a month. She would jointly fund this with the French. In order to help kickstart this idea that was obsessing her, she relinquished the lease on her Park Lane house. She sold all the furniture. I don't know if she told her husband about this. He was serving with the Indian Army as an interpreter. And, putting a spin on the idea of being a tax exile, she moved herself, her considerable American investments, and her 3 daughters to Paris, thereby relinquishing membership of the British Tax Club. A small footnote is that by the end of the war, her fortune had all but evaporated. In July 1915, the May Borden Hôpital Chirurgical Mobile Numéro 1 consisting of 12 long wooden portable huts with reinforced windows to take the strain of heavy firing, was up and running. As the name mobile or mobile implies, like all casualty clearing stations, it could be packed up and transported with only a few hours' notice. Initially, it was established on the road between Dunkirk and Ypres. The hospital's reputation soon grew, and the wounded pleaded to be sent there. The mortality rate of 5% was the best statistic for the entire front for that stage of the war. Winter 1915 was grim, and the weather lashed the flimsy huts. May slept beneath a mackintosh sheet with an umbrella propped over her head. Guns and shellfire were the constant musical accompaniment. In 1916, the French field of military operations moved further south. May bombarded the French Chief of General Staff, Joffre, with letters detailing the reasons why her hospital should also move. Eventually, he held up the white flag of surrender. She established her Hôpital de l'Évacuation at Bray-sur-Somme. It would become one of the most important military hospitals in France and would soon be directly in the war zone. So much so that in September 1916, as the first tanks trundled down the road at nearby Flers, May immortalised these obscene crabs, armoured toads, crushing under their bellies whatever stood in their way. May's hospital had become a city of huts, and the guns beyond the hill sound like the waves of the sea, pounding, pounding, and the sky is awhir with aeroplanes. She wrote also, "Sometimes we are bombarded, and all the time troops and more troops stream past. Soon these troops would stream back, disfigured, maimed, and with their wits as shattered as their bodies. Determined that her patients would have the best care that she and her 13 hand-picked nurses could give, she fell foul of the French authorities. They considered that a wounded man's uniform was more important to save than his life. At her hospital, uniforms would not automatically be preserved for future use. Instead, she would cut them through with knives or scissors to avoid inflicting additional sufferings on the already pain-crazed men. Woe betide anyone who tried to stop her." Once again, her hospital's mortality rate, although terrifyingly high, was half the 30% that was expected of Somme frontline fatalities. One of the many ironies that did not escape her was that it was women who had become the frontline soldiers in the second battlefield, where women fought to save the lives that the first battlefield had sought to destroy. Her wartime private life was as tumultuous and as gender-reversed as her public one. At Bray, in autumn 1916, a Captain Edward Louis Spears, attached to the staff office and thus serving away from the front line, visited her hospital in an official capacity. Her first glimpse of him was of something very rare this close to the Somme front, a whole man with all his limbs, eyes, ears, and even a nose intact and in the right place. His first view of her was of a small woman in a mud-splattered and blood-stained April. The sonnet she wrote to the man who would soon become her lover and eventually her second husband encapsulates the gender reversals which infuse her truly magnificent poem. She wrote, "No, no, there is some sinister mistake. You cannot love me now. I am no more a thing to touch, a pleasant thing to take into one's arms. How can a man adore a woman with black blood upon her face, a cap of horror on her pallid head, mirrors of madness in the sunken place of eyes, hands dripping with the slimy dead? Go, cover close your proud, untainted brow. Go quickly. Leave me to the hungry lust of monstrous pain. I am his mistress now. These are the frantic beds of his delight. Here I succumb to him anew each night." Whilst May and the 24,000 professional nurses in Blighty and in every theatre of war ministered to and comforted the dying, those at home could only sit and wait. Well over 700,000 received the telegram or letter that they had dreaded since their loved one had marched off to that beating drum. When the long-dreaded news of his death came, many found an outlet in writing. Two of the most moving poems I have come across demonstrate the classlessness of grief. Both these women's beloved sons died in the Dardanelles. Young Royal Inniskillen Fusilier John Vincent Toy was killed on the 2nd of July 1915. His mother Sarah believed that had he been buried in his local churchyard in Derry, some comfort then we could have got, we knew where he was laid, bedecked the grave top with our tears and kept it bright arrayed. Sarah's wish, like that so many of hundreds of thousands of others' mothers, was unfulfilled. Her child's body was never found. He is remembered on the magnificent Helles Memorial at Sudel Bahia in Gallipoli. When German-born Alexandra Grantham bade her son Hugo farewell at the station, did she sense that this would be her last glimpse of him? 101 years ago today, almost to the hour, he was killed taking part in a near pointless diversionary attack near Gully Ravine, Gallipoli. A multi-talented, highly cultured woman who wrote songs, poetry and plays, she composed this ode to 20-year-old Lieutenant Hugo Grantham of the Essex Regiment. Finally, after 1,566 days, the war to end war was over. A long 2 years later, on November the 11th, 1920, the unknown warrior was interred at Westminster Abbey. Outside, in the packed streets, the women's eyes are red, those hungry eyes of starved mother love that strive to pierce the coffin lid above the nameless envoy of the nameless dead. Meanwhile, the Imperial War Graves Commission was creating the magnificent cemeteries in which the known and those only known unto God were interred, but thousands of bodies had never been found. They too needed fitting memorials. On the 24th of July 1927, the Menin Gate, the great memorial to the missing of the Ypres salient, was unveiled in the presence of largely, but not exclusively, generals, diplomats, royalty, and other women, and if you remember, my own mother. This gate in Ypres was chosen in the Imperial War Graves Commission's words, because of the hundreds of thousands of men who have passed through it on their way to the battlefields. The names carved on the panels of Portland stone are those of 57,895 officers and men of this salient, whose bodies were either never found or could not be identified. The bereaved, and particularly the poorest mothers of the missing, who, thanks to the charitable work of the St Barnabas Association, attended the unveiling, were graciously welcomed by the residents of Wipers, as pilgrims are to this day, continuing the bond forged in blood and suffering between the citizens of Belgium and the men and women of the British Empire. Whenever I attend the last post ceremony at the Menin Gate, the words of young VAD Carola Oman, who worked in the salient in the final months of the war and during the reconstruction, haunt me. She gazed along the Menin Road in March 1919. Over the flat, dim land, I see you moving methodically, under a dark, wide sky full of low clouds. You are gone from our loving. No fret of ours or grief can touch you now. The road speaks nothing to our longing now. Yet, I wonder, are you wholly gone? For those of us who a century later are still trying to comprehend the magnitude, the horror, and the sufferings of those tumultuous years, the simple lines in the powerful poems written by amateur and professional women versifiers and included in Tumult and Tears reveal a different story of the Great War, one told for the first time exclusively through the eyes and lives of its women poets. Thank you. If anybody's got any questions, obviously I'm happy to take them. Or we will shell-shocked.
Knowing a little bit about the subject,
Having lived with 500 dead women.
I'm just going to ask a slightly rhetorical question. Why was there so much poetry as a whole in the First World War?
Well, there were lots of reasons. First of all, it was because it was a very, very accessible genre, far more than it is now, and poetry was taught in schools. A lot of learning was actually done through poetry. In France, it was done through patriotic songs. In England, it was very much done through poetry. Children learned their grammar through poetry. They learnt, they acquired memory skills through poetry, recitation skills. So it was a genre that was very familiar to them. And it was something that the public very much responded to. Huge numbers of newspapers actually were offering, sort of suggesting poetry competitions, and people would write poetry. They did a lot of courting by poetry. They would send their loved one a poem, and he would write a poem back. And in fact, some of you would have heard of Sir Ian Hamilton, who was the ill-fated, which we won't go into that, commander-in-chief of the British forces at Gallipoli to begin with. And he and his wife, before the war, had actually courted through poetry. They actually sort of wrote and discussed their poems and which are your favourite ones. And when they found they both shared favourite ones, this seemed to them to be, an indication that this would be a happy match. It wasn't one made in heaven, but at least it was one made in poetry. And so there was this sort of popular. It was the genre that Facebook, as I said, or the Twitter of the time was poetry. And there are thousands, literally thousands of poems that were written, and not thousands of them don't appear in any anthology, but they have been preserved and archived. The Imperial War Museum in Birmingham, they've got huge collections of poetry, so if anybody fancies researching poetry, there's plenty out there. There's room for plenty more PhDs. I haven't cornered the field.
Interestingly, you mentioned the unknown warrior.
Yes.
And which was David Railton's idea, Father David Railton,
Yes.
whose father was the second of command of William Booth.
Yes, yes, yes.
And the remains of the unknown soldier was transported from France on HMS Verlaine to Dover, and from Dover, of course, to Victoria, Platform 8. What's interesting is that on that carriage, previously, the body of Edith Cavell was transported on that same carriage. and she had helped something going around to 100 wounded British soldiers to escape. And of course, she got shot.
And then what they did was they actually painted the roof, because actually Edith Cavell was just sort of tucked onto a commuter train, on the back of a commuter train, so that so everybody would know what carriage she was in. They painted the roof white, but I just think it's a lovely idea of the sort of commuter train trundling into Victoria with a great sort of heroine, as she was seen in Edith Cavell, in the compartment. I don't think it was Southern Railway then, which was probably the thing for those of you who have to suffer Southern Railway.
Isn't it interesting, Viv, that at the time people would be very aware of women's poetry, it wouldn't be unusual, and it's the anthologies that shut them out?
It completely shut them out, and if you track it, in 1919 there are still a lot of women's poetry, women's poems in anthologies. By 1929 they've completely and utterly disappeared, and I think it was probably sort of the reaction, the angry young men almost who came back, and the sort of the backlash there was against women who were seen to have done well out of the war, and so therefore because most of the editors were male, they seemed to shut them out and leave them in the wilderness for 3/4 of a century. But they are back there now. But not all 500 of them, only a select number. And in fact, the ones that I've chosen very on purpose to represent not just the great poets, but the heartfelt poets as well, who wrote from the heart and whose words speak to us just as loudly as those of the truly accomplished poets. So I had a slightly different, if you like, criteria in mind, and it wasn't going to be just the ones who could be seen as being great poets. It was telling the story of the war through their eyes and their poetry.
Can I ask another one? Another rhetorical one? In terms of who wrote the poems, in terms of their class, what does that look like?
Obviously you're getting more poems. You seem to get more poems from the educated women, but that could well be because they had access to the publishers. And for example, Vera Brittain had a collection of poems published, the VAD, who you know about. And her father actually was able to, he was a paper manufacturer, so he was able to promise the publisher, I think it was 8 reams of antique paper. Your munitions worker, the only outlet she could find for her poetry was in the Munitions Journal, the magazine, which thank goodness some of them are preserved at the IWM. And that type of sort of journal or nurses magazine, a great source if we're sort of looking across the spectrum. And Sarah Troy wrote her poem for her son, a beautiful poem for her son, and that was preserved in Derry's memorial book. So women found outlets, but they didn't find the publishers necessarily. So a lot of the published women were sort of middle, upper class, but they were far from being the only poets.
Is there a poem for you that stands out that's your favourite?
Depends on the day of the week. depends on my mood. I do love Mary Gordon because I love her gender reversal and the way she sees this idea of women fighting a battle that the men have created, and yet the women are fighting their own battle. So I'm very, very fond of her. I like our Essex poet Alexandra Grantham, but that might be slightly biased. I enjoy the fun ones as well because everybody needs a bit of relaxation now and again. But I couldn't say that I have a favourite. No. Which one springs to mind? It just depends, and I'm sure probably both of my daughters would announce that I will quote them left, right, and centre, just whatever the mood takes me. I will. And when things go badly, there was one Scottish woman who basically said that whatever we haven't got, we invent, and whatever we can't invent, we do without. And I think that's sort of a great. Sometimes that can be quite a bon mot to take one along life's arduous way. I think we're all inventing a new roadmap at the moment, aren't we? Let's hope we manage to invent it.
Were there radio programmes with poetry?
No, because radio was barely known then. But one war poet who is actually in the anthology, and she's the one that the line "The Misty Seagirt Island" comes from. She actually read her poetry. It was one of the first radio broadcasts to be live on Armistice Day, and I think it was Armistice Day about middle of the 1920s, and she actually read her poetry live on the radio. Still desperately trying to find a recording of it. She was from Sheffield, so it was sort of post-war, the poems were read.
Do you know if there's any evidence of female poetry before the First World War? For example, the suffrage movement?
Yes, and there are a few, some of the nurses in the Boer War were also writing poetry, and I think there was quite a lot of suffrage poetry as well, because of this sort of popular medium. It was a way of expressing thoughts relatively quickly and in a relatively succinct form.
Viv, where can I buy a book?
We're getting that's where I come in. Well, Viv, thank you very much again. Big hand.